so excited to share with you the inaugural, the first episode of Home of Houseplants, the podcast. A stunningly special guest to start off the series, well, the first series, the series of many, the many of series, I hope, in relation to all things indoor plants, and that is Neil Crafter, one of Australia's, if not Australia's, leading self-taught expert on philodendrons, although Neil will take issue with his definition or my classification of him as an expert. So many topics covered in the 1 hour, ranging from Neil's preferred propagation method to the very recent development in the breakaway genus from the Philodendron category, and you'll learn all about that, and a few hints and tips on where Neil Crafter himself sources the rare and unusual plants to add to his philodendron collection. So I really do hope you enjoy this podcast episode. Please leave your comments or provide me any feedback so I can get better and better each episode. Let's go. Hello and welcome to the first episode of Home of Houseplants, a podcast that's all about indoor plants, and the specific plants that fall beneath that category include philodendrons. And I'm here at the home of Neil Crafter. Some of you, or many of you, will know Neil from many Facebook pages, including Planet Philodendron and various other types of forums, where Neil constantly and effortlessly provides advice to those who are seeking identification assistance or advice about their various philodendrons. And indeed, Neil often can also assist in other areas as well. And so it's my absolute honour and privilege to be here with Neil today. Neil lives in a beachside suburb of Adelaide called Hallett Cove, and is a collector, a lifelong collector, I think, of philodendrons in particular. And I have had personally the honour and privilege of seeing Neil's collection in his glass house in his backyard, and it's breathtaking to say the least. And I do hope to post an image of Neil in his glass house on the show notes of this podcast, so you can put a face to a name and indeed catch a glimpse of some of the beautiful philodendrons in Neil's collection. Neil Crafter, welcome.
Thank you, Jo. Lovely to have you over and have a chance to have a chat about one of my favourite subjects.
Favourite subject. Neil, I think it makes sense to start from the beginning. How did it all begin? Specifically, your interest in philodendrons.
Well, I guess my interest in philodendrons goes back to studying at university, and I did a Bachelor of Architecture degree here at the University of Adelaide, and architects have a big studio in which to do their study. We have desks arranged in there, and one of my friends brought in an indoor plant, and then that gradually grew to 2 or 3. And I thought, oh, that's a nice way of sort of livening up your desk area in the studio. And I guess I must have bought a philodendron, and it really started from there.
Neil, architecture was your qualification, so I'm not hearing any degrees in botany or anything along those lines. Would it be fair to say you're a self-taught expert?
Yeah, very, very much so. And I think, I shy away from using the term expert. I don't really subscribe to that. I mean, I'm self-taught to some degree, but I've also learnt from a number of other people in Australia who have been willing to share their knowledge. And that's the nice thing about the plant world, especially aroids, is that there's a number of people who are very willing to share their knowledge, and they did that with me, and I'm I guess trying to pay that forward and do the same sort of thing for others. So I guess when I then got started in thinking I could grow more and more philodendrons, started collecting them. In those days there was no internet. We're talking about late 1970s, right, early 1980s. and you had to do everything by either telephone or by writing.
Okay.
So you'd write off and get a mail order catalogue from a nursery up in Queensland or something like that, and then you'd write back and close a postal order or the things that we don't see anymore.
No.
And hope that they received it, and then eventually some plants might arrive in the mail. No express post in those days.
No,
it was probably quicker actually than
Probably was.
in reality. So yeah, I gradually started building my collection up, and I got to corresponding with I guess the man who is probably the most knowledgeable and famous aroid botanist from the Missouri Botanic Gardens, which is Dr. Tom Croat. And back in those days, we would write letters to each other. He was very, very kind and sharing to write letters to someone he'd never met in Australia and share his knowledge. And ultimately that developed to the point where I did my first importation of philodendrons from him. I got I paid for a whole lot of cuttings, paid for them to be sent over to Australia, then paid for the permits, paid for the quarantine. Very expensive and long-winded process. You eventually end up with some philodendrons, not all of them correctly identified, unfortunately, but most of them were good. And so I started building up my collection, I guess, from some importations that I did, and also from, I guess, other collectors and, nurseries, etc. In those days, you could go around to local nurseries and find some unusual philodendrons. At least they were unusual. These were probably the days before the tissue cultured plants had hit.
Yes.
And so, there were a number of sort of smaller nurseries scattered through the suburbs of Adelaide.
Yes.
In the days before, I guess, before the real estate values warranted their closure and sale. So that was a fun way to sort of build up, and I ultimately sort of got my collection to the point where I was living at Brooklyn Park. I converted the garage or the shed there into a pseudo greenhouse by taking off the roof sheets and the side sheets and replacing them with some polycarbonate sheets, and that proved to be pretty good. And I've had the chance to travel around to Australia, other parts of Australia, as part of my work, and also I generally managed to tack on a visit to botanic gardens or see some local collectors and nurseries and things like that, and just gradually built my collection up.
A lot of time spent at libraries as well, Neil, at that time?
Yeah, I did. When I was studying at Adelaide University, I would spend a bit of time over in the Botanic Gardens library.
Yes.
And they were very generous to let me, being a non-botanist type person, to let me go through all of their books and information and journals that they had. And that, I've still, got most of that material that I copied and
Wonderful.
And collected back in those early days. So yeah, I've always sort of maintained an interest. I joined the International Aroid Society, the IAS, served for a few years as one of the directors, which was good. And then, I think, in recent times, I was able to contribute to the startup of the Australian, or the Aroid Society of Australia.
And I understand you're a committee member as well.
Yes, yeah, I'm a founding committee member on that, and we're a young society, but we're building up our membership, and so far it's proven to be a good, useful social and knowledge sharing society for the people who do join.
You'd be well aware, being on the committee, that there has been, I think, what can only be described, in Australia at least, is a renewed interest and enthusiasm for indoor plants generally, but I'll put aroids into that category. I know that you yourself, Neil, are a collector purely of philodendrons, and that's, I think you've said recently to me that, that's the line in the sand that one must draw if you are to pursue the interest as much as you have and the detail of knowledge that you have. You are strictly a purist collector of philodendrons.
Well, that's true, and I guess philodendrons captured my imagination of something about them that did that. It's a bit hard probably to put your finger on it now after all these years, but there's something about the plants, the way they grow, the flowers especially, and so that's really sort of been my focus, and I've resisted the temptation to go off into other genera of anthuriums or monsteras or different bacchias, all of those sorts of things I've resisted. And I said, because there's at least 700 species of philodendrons, huge number of hybrids, probably another 300 or 400, who knows, yet to be collected in the wild that haven't even been named yet. So there's there's a scope that I'm never going to get to running out of philodendrons to collect and grow. And I guess one of the things I've been I have to say that I'm a collector by nature. I've collected old golf clubs, I've collected books, various other memorabilia type things, and they're very static. Those things, you look at your book. Hopefully next year it's exactly the same as it was when you last opened it, barring insect attacks or things like that. But plants are, being the living, breathing entities that they are, they go through cycles and growth and all of the things that make it interesting to go out into the greenhouse each morning and have a look and see what's happening, which of my plants are doing well, which ones aren't, trying to figure out why that might be, and sometimes it's just it's a mystery. So there's that attraction to it, and I guess as you mentioned, sort of being a philodendron purist, I've had to come to terms with a recent shock, although it may not have been an unexpected one, that a whole subgroup of philodendrons, being the stigma, have been taken out of philodendron genus and into their own new genus of Thaumatophyllum. And so that now means, because I've always grown the stigma philodendrons as well, now I'm a two genus person.
Yes,
but
you
it's
have branched out a little now.
Well, the botanist branched out for me, if you like.
Can you explain, if we can describe the stigma philodendrons, that they are hardier perhaps than some of the other philodendrons, and you have grown them outdoors, Neil?
Yeah, look, as a general rule, yes, they are. The stigma philodendrons have that particular name because of some particular characteristics of their flower. Right. And so that's, stigma. We know what a stigma is in a flower, and so that particular name describes that characteristic of a group of maybe 15 or 18 species, and they're commonly were known as tree philodendrons because they grow up generally on quite a thick trunk, a rosette of leaves arrayed at the top, and they're quite unique looking philodendrons, especially when you compare them with the normal range of relatively thin stemmed climbing type philodendrons. One of the interesting aspects of all of that is that no one has ever successfully crossed a Meconostigma philodendron with another philodendron from another subgroup. They just don't cross, and I think that's also one of the reasons why there was a parting of the ways, is that there's something about that group that won't allow them to be hybridised with other philodendrons. Plus, they did a whole lot of genetic testing as they do these days, and really found that they were not sufficiently closely related to the remainder of the philodendrons to be able to stay within that genus framework.
The genus that you just spoke of, the new genus that's been established, are they isolated to a particular part of the world, geographically speaking?
Well, geographically speaking, they are. They're mostly Brazilian species. They're generally, I guess you would say, Atlantic coast type philodendrons, generally lower elevations. They range down as far as Uruguay, below Brazil, and they're probably more savanna type plants than sort of jungle plants. So.
Neil, that is also a relatively recent development in the world of aroids, the establishment of the new genus.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's only in the last, about the middle of 2018, so not long ago now.
No, absolutely not. And that, can you just explain to the people who are listening who is responsible for that decision?
Well, there's
and how is it sort of communicated?
How does it come about?
Yes.
Well, look, there are only a certain number of botanists that specialise in aroids. It's not a huge plant family, and there's only sort of a certain number of specialists in it. There's only a few from, I guess, Western countries. There's Simon Mayo from the Kew Gardens in London, and Dr. Crote, who I talked about earlier, from Missouri Botanic Gardens. But most of the aroid botanists are from South America, South and Central America, being sort of their native plants, if you like. And so in the same way that you'd expect that the specialists in the Australian flora of eucalypts, etc., would be Australian. Well, in this case, they're Brazilian or the countries where the philodendrons grow. So essentially a group of the specialist botanists, I think might be six authors of this paper. They put their brains together and generally did this reassessment of the Meconostigma subgroup, did the genetic testing and determined that they should be split. And so they wrote up a paper. The paper went through peer review, was published, and in that instance, that's it. There's no, it's recognised at that point.
How fascinating. In terms of Australian philodendrons, are there any? Are there any, firstly, Neil, that are purely, I'm looking for the term here, native to Australia?
Indigenous, perhaps?
Indigenous, thank you, Indigenous, thank you.
No, the philodendrons are purely what they call neotropical, which are South American. So philodendrons, range through from northern Argentina through Uruguay, Brazil, Peru, etc., all the way up through Central America to Mexico. Okay. So the southern parts of Mexico are sort of their northern limits, and that's it. In Australia, there's no philodendron flora at all, but there are native aroids. So there are local indigenous aroids that grow in Queensland, but they're not philodendrons.
Neil, if I can take you back to your own collection here, I notice as we sit in your beautiful home that you have contained your collection within your freestanding climate-controlled greenhouse. I'd call it more of a glass house, but if we can describe to the listeners the approximate dimensions, and perhaps firstly why you have contained it there. It may be just for personal family circumstances, but I gather a large reason would be your ability to control the climate.
Look, that's that's part of it. Going back about 10 years, my collection lapsed, and I started again about 6 or 7 years ago to grow philodendrons again, just really through some personal circumstances. Yeah. And I decided that this time round that I wanted to get a purpose-built greenhouse, and so I bought a greenhouse kit, 5 metres by 3 metres, and built the footings for it. Set it up in such a way that I guess the first 2/3 as you come into the greenhouse is for plant stands and pots. That's set on gravel, and the back third of the greenhouse is a planting bed, little like what you would find in a greenhouse in a botanic gardens, although mine's on a vastly smaller scale. But I wanted to have the ability to put philodendrons into the ground, when I say the ground, into potting mix, essentially, that I filled this back section. If they go down through the potting mix, they will be into the soil, the native soil here in Hallett Cove, which is quite rocky and limestoney, so I don't know quite whether they enjoy that or not, but they're certainly surviving pretty well in there.
And can you share why have you done that? You've divided it between the potted section and the in-ground section.
Really for my own desire, really, that I wanted to be able to have an environment where the plants could be in the ground. I didn't have to muck around with pots. Yep. A number of the philodendrons that are in there are very large, and I've planted them in there, knowing that hoping that I would be able to get them up to size, and that I've been able to do that. And realistically, I don't think they would have achieved the size that they have if they were in pots. So once you put them in the ground, it's a bit of a keep your fingers crossed and hope that they do well. Now, some of them have done exceptionally well and others haven't, but that's a bit of trial and error, if you like.
In Adelaide, where both Neil and I live, have the fortunate luck, I should say, but we're very happily Adelaide-based residents. We have a climate here which has searingly hot summers, as we're experiencing today.
Just like today. As
we're recording this, it's about 42 degrees outside, and humidity feels like it's at 0 at this point in time. Full sun. But we equally have quite cool winters. It's very common to, in the middle of winter, have temperatures reach 0 overnight, and so Neil, you have to equip your greenhouse with conditions that can cope with the baking heat of summer and the cold of Adelaide winters. I know you've got a misting system. Can you talk about how, firstly, you cope with the heat of summer and to keep your philodendrons happy?
Well, the heat of summer is actually easier to cope with than the cold, and cheaper too. Essentially, I've got probably about 30 or 40 misting heads through the greenhouse, running on a little pipe network. I've got a fairly basic controller that allows me to control when they come on and when they go off. But on a day like today, when you've said it's 42 degrees outside, it's full sun. Essentially, what I've got is I've got a louver window on the back of the greenhouse. I've got doors on the front, So what I do is I have the misters on all day and the window open, the door partly open at the front, and it gets a little bit of flow-through ventilation, and with the misting comes evaporative cooling in a sense. So on a 42-degree day, the temperature inside the greenhouse is a little bit more comfortable, albeit quite humid, but might only be 35 or something like that, and that's a temperature that the plants can certainly cope with. Fortunately, we don't have 42-degree days every day, but this is sort of the ultimate, the best time of year for philodendrons to be actively growing, because through winter a lot of them just sort of shiver and look at me and say, "Is this the best you can do?"
Before we just quickly touch base with you about what you do during winter, I have had the honour and privilege of seeing Neil's collection, and in the past I've witnessed in action this contraption, which I believe is commercially known as a hydrofogger. Neil demonstrated this to me about a year or two ago when I first met Neil, and it's effectively a circular machine that pumps out fog. Neil, would that be fair?
Yes. The water goes into a tray at the bottom of the machine, and there's a motor, and it really essentially through centrifugal force turns the liquid water into a fog, very fine droplets, and this gets sort of drifted out through the greenhouse. Unfortunately, hasn't been working for the last 6 or 8 months, and it's an American contraption, as you've described it. Yes. No one makes them here in Australia, and I'm not really sure of the best way to get it repaired. But that's another story. But when it's working, it's a great sensation, because it's like you're at 15,000 metres in the forest, and the cloud comes through, and you're just enveloped by this misty cloud, and the plants really love it. But they've had to do without it for a while.
And then would you turn that on, for example, on a day like today? Obviously, that if it was operational would be working a couple of times a day. Would you turn it on a hot day like this?
Look, generally on a really hot day like today, I've found that the misters are much more effective. Yep. The misters, the droplet size is much larger than the fog machine makes, and I think it evaporates easier. So I think the usefulness is probably more in the not so hot days.
Right. Okay, there you go. Obviously, Neil, our friends who share our common interest in philodendrons are in Queensland and New South Wales and other states where it is perhaps a more tropical climate, and they obviously would have no need for a machine such as that. And so really a misting, more so a fogging machine, is really useful where you have low humidity.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. I mean, look, philodendrons really appreciate humidity, and if you don't have humidity, you'll never grow the species to the size that they can ultimately be grown to. Yes. And a number of the softer leaved varieties really need to be in a greenhouse to protect them from the wind. Where I live here at Hallett Cove, where we're recording, I can see the ocean through my sliding doors, and the wind comes off the sea at a pretty fierce rate here. And growing philodendrons outside, which I do, because there are some hardier, thicker leaved type philodendrons. One good example is Philodendron Congo, which is quite hardy to grow.
And commonly found in garden centres.
And commonly found in garden centres. So it's one that if you can provide a shady spot for it, it doesn't like full sun, but if you can give it a shady spot, sort of a moist climate, protect it from the wind, it can be quite a hardy and attractive plant to grow outside. So I've experimented since I've been here with putting a few, as some plants have gotten too big for the greenhouse. I think, I'm going to give that a try outside because it's got the sort of leaves that I think the word's coriaceous, that are a little bit thicker and stiffer, less likely to be damaged by the wind and dehydrate in the hotter weather. So those I've given a go, and some have been successful. The downside, obviously, also is the cold, and you alluded to the cold weather that we get, and yes, through the middle of July we can get drop down to 2 degrees at night. I have a 2 kilowatt fan heater that I use to heat my greenhouse in at night in winter, and a couple of months either side, so it's probably going for maybe five months of the year, and it's a balance for me between the temperature that I desire and the cost of electricity, which, as we know, especially for us here in South Australia, the cost of electricity has skyrocketed in recent years, and so there's a bit of a balance there. Got to turn the dial down a little bit so that it's not as hot. Yes, we've lost a few plants through winter as a result of the heating not being
hot enough. Yes,
not being sufficient for their needs. But that was sort of the good of the greater good, I suppose, of balancing the resources.
Neil, I should add, Neil's fan heater that he's speaking of is actually one from a horticultural supplier, which is obviously built of materials that can resist greenhouse environments. So it's not your typical fan heater that you buy from Target or things like that. Target, so in case anyone's interested, and you can find them easily, I think, on the internet. I have a few as well on Neil's recommendations. Neil, ever been tempted by propagation mats or heat mats that are thermostatically controlled?
Well, yes, in fact I do have a heat mat out in the greenhouse that I use to put under my cuttings in winter, and certainly I think they're quite beneficial. Philodendrons and the propagation method that I use with utilising moist sphagnum moss, the bottom heat really helps the cuttings to strike. Obviously I don't have it on during summer, but in winter I certainly found it helpful because we've all got cuttings that we desperately want to grow, whether they're rare or common ones. It's one of the really enjoyable parts of the hobby once you get past the stage of just buying fully established plants. We start to think about, well, how can we take this up another notch? And propagating our own plants is a very rewarding means of establishing plants, and then it enables you as a collector to swap cuttings with other people, etc. So it just sort of broadens your horizon from just buying established plants, and certainly that would be something that I'd be encouraging all people who end up, if they get bitten by the plant bug, be it aroids or whatever, that propagation of your own plant material is a fascinating thing to do.
Neil, I'm fascinated to share with people your propagation method, because after meeting you and some other mutual new friends of ours through the Arrow Association who've met you recently, have had a lot of luck with your propagation method, and I was wondering if you could share it with us.
Well, look, I first up, it's not necessarily mine. I don't lay claim to having invented it, and I think it's actually the use of sphagnum moss in propagating plants has been very widespread. So, but I guess, I probably sort of refined it, the methodology a little bit, but essentially I have a pot, a plastic pot, small, fill it up with moist sphagnum, and insert the cutting into it. And it really depends upon the size of the cutting as to sort of the direction. Some cuttings that I might actually lay and only partly cover on a bigger bed of sphagnum. Others I'll use pots. But just to describe the pot method, essentially we'd be inserting the cutting, generally a 2-node cutting, and essentially what you're wanting the cutting to do is to firstly establish roots into the sphagnum, and then for one of the buds just above the node to start to shoot out with a new stem and leaves. And to encourage that, we make a little bit of a humidity crib, insert the pot and the cutting inside a Ziploc bag, a clear Ziploc bag. You can buy them in Woolworths, and if you want to get adventurous and get bigger ones, you can go onto eBay and buy them, you know, 1/2 metre by 1/2 metre size for bigger cuttings. But essentially then I water in the cutting well, let the pot drain, put in a couple of small bamboo stakes to stop the bag collapsing on itself, and that sort of holds the air in the bag, if you like, and then you just leave it somewhere warm. In my case, they go into the greenhouse.
And if it was winter time, on the propagation mat? And
winter time on a propagation mat. Now, they're readily purchasable from nurseries and from off the internet, so there's plenty of sources for those heat mats, and it's definitely a good tool to have, because once you get like the bottom heat into the cutting, you can have it struck in a month.
And I must add, in my experience in trialling this method, the condensation, particularly as the plant cutting potted in the sphagnum moss when it is on the propagation mat, I do find that there is condensation on the inside of the bag, which then obviously falls back down to keep the plant moist. In my experience, have found that the watering requirements of a cutting in that setup are quite minimal.
Very minimal, yes. I mean, I'd be opening my bags maybe once a month, probably. Just depends upon how curious I am as to how they're going. Sometimes if it's a really special cutting, I might be encouraged to look at them a little bit more often. But once a month you look at them, and then you just sort of poke your finger into the moss, and generally it's still fairly moist. Some of them I'll just take out and give them a good hose through, wet it all up again and get it going again. But it's not like something that you have to monitor every day or week or anything like that. They can go for at least a month without needing to be checked.
And that's quite different to cuttings that I've propagated, perhaps on more open, flat propagation trays where sitting on a heat mat. I'm talking here about peperomias in particular. They dry out very quickly. So if you aren't using the sphagnum method inside the bag, you have to watch it very carefully, because it dries out within a day.
And another method that I have used in the past with fairly good success too is a tray, but one of those ones with a little mini plastic greenhouse cover over the top. You put that on a heat mat. You can get maybe a dozen cuttings laid out on the tray that comes with it, and you've just got to make sure that it doesn't dry out. The objective is to give it a really warm, humid environment, and I think probably, yes, you do get some failures, but I would say that I get sort of 90% success rate out of my cuttings using this method. Some just don't take, and that's just part and parcel of the fun of doing it.
A piece of information that did make me feel slightly better, Neil, was when you shared with me the fact that you do lose established plants from time to time. I in particular have sourced a number of cuttings of Philodendron gigas, which despite my best efforts fail me repeatedly, and and I think when I mentioned that to you, you did try to help me feel a little better, and shared with me that you yourself still do lose plants from time to time.
Yeah, and look, the reality for me is that, yes, I've got a climate controlled to a certain point, greenhouse, and by and large the philodendrons that are in there are doing well. There are some, though, that are not really doing as well as I'd like, and that's really just the reality. Some don't like the climate that you're providing, or the potting mix, or whatever, and others do. So, but we do lose plants from time to time, and while I don't like it, especially if it's one that I've paid a bit of money for, then it's just sort of, you just have to grin and bear it.
Yes, part of the challenge, I think.
It is part of the challenge, and
genus.
Certainly in the environment, the plant environment that we are in today, and as you mentioned before, Joe, that there's a lot more interest in the hobby of growing plants, whether they're indoor or tropical plants in a greenhouse. It's much more popular than probably it's ever been. And that's really good. Unfortunately, what it's done is it's driven up the prices of a lot of plants. Anything that you might have thought was on the rarer side, especially if it's got variegation.
Yeah, that is a trend I'm noticing significantly, the variegation. But yes, obviously the lack of supply is a real issue. I'm sure it's not just the case in Australia, but worldwide, in that a lot of these lovely small nurseries and growers have fallen by the wayside, perhaps over the last 30 years, as the trend or fashion that was indoor plants perhaps in the late 70s and 80s fell away for a long time. And now there is a very low level of supply, I think, worldwide, which is a shame, but and hence the prices that are being paid for the plants. But what attracts me particularly, Neil, to whether it be philodendrons or monsteras, aroids generally, and indeed the larger indoor plant category, it's the foliage. Unlike perhaps whether it be orchids or other types of plants, it is centred around the bloom or the flower. For me, the foliage is the spectacular part of aroids in particular.
Yeah, look, I think that's their main game, if you like, is the variation through the different aroid genera, and then the species within each genera. Then there's some very unique and colourful and dramatic foliage, ranging from very small leaves to massive ones that might be 2 metres in length. So there's a great variety. There's something for everybody, I think, at the end of the day. But I mean, as a keen philodendron grower, I'm personally very excited when my philodendrons do flower. I find their flowers very attractive. They've got a very interesting and what I think is an attractive scent to them. So the flowering side of it is something that I find quite intriguing, and a big part of why I grow philodendrons as well is the different flower forms and colours and aromas.
And the philodendron flower is what is technically referred to as the inflorescence?
Yes, it's an inflorescence because it's actually made up of a whole lot of individual flowers, if you look at the definition of a flower. So it's an inflorescence, and it's got the typical aroid spathe enclosed in a spadix, which is the structure that frames the spadix. So it's a very attractive flower and very colourful.
Neil, how often do philodendrons flower?
I've got some philodendrons that flower all year round. They don't actually stop. So it's the thaumatophyllums, the old stigma philodendrons that we talked about before. They will only flower in the spring and summer. Winter here in Australia is shutdown mode. Mine don't put out any new leaves. They don't flower until spring hits, and then they'll say, right, I can start growing again. And then it's sort of get on as much growth as you can for 5 or 6 months and then go into shutdown mode again.
Neil, I could speak to you for hours about this subject. It's fascinating, and given your breadth of knowledge is encyclopedic, if that's the word, encyclopedic. But it would be amiss of me if I didn't sort of give outline with you sort of the rough nature of your collection. I think it includes, examples from what I'm going to refer to as the subcategories. I know you've got a number of what are commonly referred to as velvet-type philodendrons. I would include in that the gigas, now correct me if I'm pronouncing these incorrectly, melanochrysum, of course gloriosum. There's also a cross, I believe, with gloriosum.
Yeah, there's a cross between gloriosum and melanochrysum, which is called glorious. I also grow Philodendron verrucosum, which is another
stunner, absolute stunner.
Yeah, it's a very stunning, very widespread species through South America, and the particular form that I've got growing here, I've sort of, by observing its growth habit and the fact that it's a winter active grower in the greenhouse, it doesn't like summer, so I've come to the conclusion that it was a high altitude collection. From sort of up in the cloud forest, maybe 1,500, 2,000 metres, where these plants grow in a much cooler environment. And so the winter in the greenhouse, when it's sort of 18 to 24 during the day, is perfect for this plant. But when it gets as hot as this, it doesn't like it at all. Shuts down, essentially.
Neil, you've also got a number that I'm going to commonly refer to them using common language, is the ones that grow and spread along the ground. Mm-hmm. They sort of scramble along the ground.
Yeah, repent is one term for those, and gloriosum that you mentioned before is one of those. Philodendron Plaumanii, Pastazanum. There's a few that like growing that way. Philodendron crassonervium is another one that will grow that way, although it will climb on occasions if it finds something to climb up. So there's a lot of different growth habits, but the majority of them are climbers. If you look at a typical philodendron, it wants to, they want to climb something, and that's comes back to the name that was chosen for the genus. Philodendron basically means tree lover. Mm-hmm. So if you see philodendrons growing in their native habitat, or even you go to Cairns or Brisbane, go to some of the botanic gardens, and you'll see palm trees and other trees and philodendrons growing 20, 30 metres up these trees. Up the
trunks, yes.
Up the trunks, and so you can see how well adapted they are in those humid climates where their aerial roots can get a hold onto the tree bark, how much they love growing. So they epitomise the genus name.
You do have a number of others, and my brief explanation will not do it justice, but we head into the painted lady, autumn queens that you have, which have got that beautiful yellow backdrop with the mottling of green through them. Yeah, look, there are a lot of hybrids that I don't grow, but there are some that really take my fancy, and so I do grow them. I know Pink Princess is quite a popular philodendron these days. I've had bad experiences with it in the past, and so I don't try and grow it anymore. I find it's a very unstable plant that it either heads in one of two directions. It either tries to put out all pink leaves, which aren't sustainable, or it goes in the other direction and there's no pink to be seen whatsoever. And so the sweet spot in the middle of where it's giving you nice variegated pink leaves is often a very short-lived form, if you like, and so it's either going one way or the other. So I've decided to devote my energies to other ones that are a bit more stable, shall we say. And Neil then has his Gold Deluxe range of his collection, which I won't embarrass Neil by going into, but there's just some stunners at the end of the spectrum where I know you have invested some money.
Yeah, and really look, these have been they're more aficionado type plants that probably will never catch on in popularity. There's a gorgeous little philodendron called Chincha mayence, which is a bit of a mouthful, I know, but it's a lovely small climbing philodendron with small narrow leaves. I'm hoping to get it to flower one day because I want to see how tiny the flowers are on this little guy, because it does flower.
It does, for those who are looking for a visual image. It's in appearance, it appears like a gum leaf. I would have almost thought an elongated gum, a eucalyptus leaf.
A small gum leaf at that.
That's
would
right.
be the sort of the shape, and the stem itself would be sort of about the thickness of a lead in a pencil. Not the pencil, but the lead.
The lead, yes. Yeah. Fascinating. And Neil, in closing, I was going to share with our listeners the means by which you do source and look at. Obviously, at the moment, the more unusual stuff, you're using eBay. Keep your eye out on eBay.
Yeah,
you never know. Facebook for market, the Facebook swap and share.
Aroids Australia, buy, swap, sell.
Yep.
You know, philodendrons come up on there from time to time, but there's no substitute for making friends and then being able to share plants between friends at the end of the day. So it's a sort of a social hobby in a sense. You can be as isolated as you want to be, but you can also, with a hobby like this, you can also be social when you want to.
Absolutely, and I think that given that you are a current committee member, probably the leading group in terms of aroids. For those who have an interest in aroids, which includes philodendrons, would be the Australian Aroid Association at a monthly membership fee of
Aroid Society of Australia.
Aroid Society of Australia. I have been, yes. And I understand it's an annual membership fee of
$25.
A hefty sum of $25 Australian dollars.
So you just don't have coffees for a couple of days, and a week probably, and you will have saved up enough money. So, look, it's based in Brisbane, and we have regular meetings up there, and obviously we're encouraging chapters. We just recently had a bit of a Christmas barbecue get together with some of our South Australian members, and certainly we're encouraging more people to join, because with more people means we can have more activities, more educational type get-togethers as well to share various people's knowledge about growing aroids. So,
and there's the corresponding Facebook pages, and there's some subgroups that fall away from that main group. So it's a great resource, and I think you also get a sort of semi-regular newsletter as well.
You do get a newsletter, yes. We put out a newsletter probably 5 or 6 times a year. So that's getting bigger and bigger as we're getting more contributors to it in terms of aroid research, etc. One of the preeminent Asian aroid researchers, Dr. Peter Boyce, is contributing information on the Asian aroids, because obviously there's the tropics aroids are widespread through Asia, and in fact there's even you'll find various species of aroids even in the Mediterranean and parts of North America. So it's a widespread plant family.
I should add that there are meetings which are mainly held in Brisbane because of the membership base being largely from that area of Australia, but I can personally attest to the wonderful plant sales that do accompany those meetings, and if you are lucky enough to attend, you can grab some fabulous plants.
Well, even buying a ticket in the raffle, the plant raffles that the society holds, there's been some very nice plants up for as prizes of the raffle, and then there are auctions. So there's a whole lot of plant acquisition methods through the society, and we also, at each of these meetings, we have a guest speaker, someone to talk about various aspects, whether it's people like Bruce Dunstan, who's been off on a number of collecting trips through South America, talking about his experiences of seeing aroids in the wild in South America. I mean, that's a fascinating topic in itself. So yeah, it's also about sharing knowledge, I guess, at the end of the day.
And to support a very good cause, and it's not often you can join something at its relatively early stages, and this is one opportunity to do so.
Indeed, it is, yeah.
Neil Crafter, it has been my absolute pleasure to have you on my podcast today.
Well, Jo, thank you very much for having me on your podcast, and I believe I might be the first.
Sure, ideal. How could I resist? I was fortunate enough to live in Adelaide, and as I've said in the introduction, one of Australia's and one of the world's leading knowledge powerhouses of philodendrons, and it's my great honour to being able to come to your beautiful home today and share some of your knowledge with the listeners.
Thank you, Jo. It's been my pleasure, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Sounds great.
Okay, cheers.
Bye. Thank you for listening to this episode of Home of Houseplants. I really do hope you enjoyed it. If you did, I would love for you to subscribe and leave a review, as it does help many others find the podcast, and in particular those that share the passion, the obsession that is growing indoor plants. I would like to give a shout out to Music Bed for the fabulous cool beats that you've heard during the course of this podcast and throughout the episodes. Home of Houseplants has a licensing agreement with musicbed.com to support the artists, both emerging and established. If you do wish to contact me, please do so via Instagram at Home of Houseplants, or via my email address, which you can easily find on the website, homeofhouseplants.com.au. Please enjoy the week, the day, your evening, whatever time you are listening to this podcast, and I look forward for you to join me on the next episode, whenever that will be in the future. Bye, guys.